There we are. Super. Can you hear me? Welcome everyone to the second day of the BRIC 2021 conference. Today's Wednesday. Today's theme is a mixed bag, but the talk this morning is about responsible metrics, and that kind of sets the theme for a talk later on in the afternoon. Just a few housekeeping notes in case this is your first time joining us. The moderator today is myself, Jeff Demain, for the morning, and then after the lunch break, it'll be Shannon Gordon. And you'll notice a certain goose theme throughout the events today. And the reason for that is that University of Waterloo, the campus, is overrun by, I think, overrun by Canada geese. I mean, you can find these geese just about anywhere in North America, but for some reason their home base happens to be the University of Waterloo. And so if we were on campus, you would see these all over the place, riding the bus, for example. A little bit of housekeeping, we're using WebEx, and so if you want to send questions to the presenter, you would send them to the host in the chat box down in the lower right-hand corner there. But at the same time, if you just want to chat amongst yourselves as a sort of a community of practice, you can send messages to the to all attendees, although the presenter won't see those live, that sort of thing. Yeah, that's the University of Waterloo Goose. Don't forget, we have a little break at 12:30, and then 2 more sessions this afternoon. Right. This morning's session is given by Chris Belter. Chris is the lead analyst for the Division of Extramural Research at NICHD, which is part of the National Institutes of Health. In fact, I know Chris because he's been at the NIH for some time, and he created and led the bibliometric services program at the NIH library. So Chris is still technically with the NIH, but not in the library now. Now he conducts analyses to inform the Institute's funding decisions and provides strategic guidance on the use of data and analytics for those funding decisions. And his talk this morning is about the responsible scientometrics, all of the questions and none of the answers. So thanks very much, and I'll pass it over to Chris.
Thanks very much. Thank you very much, Jeff. And it's really, really an honor and a pleasure to be with you all today and talking to you all today. As we get us set up, I want to say a very quick thank you to Jeff and to all of the organizers and presenters and people who are helping to run this event. This is a really great event, and it does a lot for the bibliometric research community to have these kinds of opportunities to talk to one another, share ideas, and share best practices. We don't have enough of those kinds of opportunities. So I really do appreciate everything that you all are doing. You've been doing it for a long time. So, and I also know how much work it takes to put something like this together. So thank you all very much for all that you're doing. Isabella, if you could please pass me the presenter rights so that I can get set up and going, that would be great. Thank you very much. Okay, so before I jump into my actual talk, I have a couple of quick housekeeping announcements and a couple of disclaimers to make about what I'm going to be talking about and what I'm going to be saying in this particular talk. So first of all, I am going to be expressing a lot of opinions during the course of this talk, and I wanted to just clarify that those opinions are my own and they don't necessarily reflect those of my employers, NICHD, the NIH, the US government, or just about anybody else. They are my opinions. I also want to note that all of the data that I'm going to be showing here today are unofficial. and they're provided for demonstration purposes only. So I have been doing a lot of data analyses, and I'm going to be sharing some of those analyses with you all today. But these are not official NICHD analyses or statistics, and they're really being shown to help illustrate the points that I'm trying to make during the course of my talk. So, as Jeff mentioned, I do work at NICHD, which is short for the Eunice Kennedy Shriver National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, which is a mouthful. So you'll excuse me if I refer to that as NICHD. We are a division of the National Institutes of Health, which is a biomedical funding agency, which is a division of the US federal government. We fund research on kids, basically. We're a little bit unusual at NIH in that we don't actually fund research on a disease or a bodily system. We fund research on a particular set of populations, which is kids. We fund research from conception all the way through adulthood. So everything having to do with anything in between is kind of our mission. It's a really wide scope, and it makes it really interesting to work here at NICHD because we're interested in everything from molecular biology of embryo development. We're interested in fertility, contraception. We're interested in pregnancy. We're interested in child development, intellectual development, mental health, the socioeconomic aspects of raising children and what effects those socioeconomic factors have on development, all kinds of really interesting things within that larger remit. So I work within the Division of Extramural Research at NICHD. And so my job is really working with our funding programs to decide what we as a biomedical funding agency actually decide to fund. So within my job, which I've really only been at for about 4 or 5 months now, so this is all very new to me, I really have 3 major components to what I do. The first is that I design and conduct analyses to inform NICHD funding decisions. So that's really the bread and butter of what I do. But I also provide guidance around the whole concept of metrics, the analyses, evaluation, all of those kinds of things. And then I also coordinate analytical activities across the division. So we are in the process of trying to hire a bunch more analysts to help me out. And so eventually, once all of those folks are hired, I will then be coordinating and sort of acting as team leader for all of those analyses, for those analysts across the division. Wrapped up in all 3 of these, though, is, I think, a 4th major component to my job, which is to ensure that analyses are used responsibly. I think it's my job as an analyst to provide context for the analyses that I perform. It's not enough for me to just do the analysis. I think I also need to provide context for understanding that analysis and providing guidance on ensuring that those analyses and those data are used in a responsible way. So that's really what I want to focus on in my talk today, is what that looks like for me as a funding agency. So obviously the concept of responsible metrics is a hot topic in bibliometrics right now, but often the conversations around that focus on the individual level or at the organizational level. So at the funder level, it looks a little bit different. And at the funder level, it seems to me that there's a fundamental balancing act between 2, in some ways, diametrically opposed concepts. One is the concept of responsibility, and the other is the concept of feasibility. So let me spend a little time talking about what I mean by these concepts. So for responsibility, we know from a lot of research and from a lot of analytical stories that indicator use matters. And the use of indicators, particularly the irresponsible use of indicators, puts an enormous amount of pressure on researchers to publish the right kinds of things, to publish in the right journals, to do the kinds of research that will count for these analytical indicators. And so part of my job is to ensure that whatever I end up doing doesn't make this situation worse. Hopefully I can make it better, but at least I don't want to make it worse. Responsibility also, I think, entails ensuring accuracy of the analyses and the data that we provide. So ensuring that the publication sets are correct, or at least as accurate and correct as possible, ensuring we're using the correct metrics, making sure that those metrics are accurate and measuring what we think they are, all of those kinds of things. And then finally, avoiding what I refer to as turnkey evaluations, or essentially treating everybody the same. We fund research on a wide variety of things, and we fund a lot of different kinds of mechanisms. And so what I want to do is avoid treating everyone the same and really evaluate our programs based on what they're trying to do. But at the same time, we also have to deal with what is actually possible. What can I actually do given the scope of our operations at NICHD? So NICHD is a medium-sized funding agency within the National Institutes of Health. But that means we have currently 3,700 active projects at NICHD that are associated with around 400 funding programs that collectively produce somewhere on the order of 10,000 publications a year. So what does responsibility look like given the scale of what we do? We also have to deal with the fact that we're not a very large organization. We don't have a lot of staff, honestly, and most of the staff that we do have are focused on making sure that, you know, things like the dollars actually go to the people who we think they ought to go to. Those kinds of things. We don't have a lot of room for other kinds of things, so we don't have the staff time or availability to spend a lot of time in evaluating these large programs. So what does responsibility look like? And then finally, we have a whole lot of access and availability hurdles that we need to deal with. So the overarching question for me, and what I want to spend most of my time talking about today, is how do we use data as a funding agency to inform the decisions that we make in a way that is both responsible and feasible? How do we balance these two concepts? Now, I don't actually know the answer to that question. And to be very honest, I don't know if anybody actually knows the answer to that question. But what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about what that answer might look like, what some of the things, what some of the components might be of that answer. And I'll end with giving you an idea of the direction that I'm headed. So I'll go through a couple of lessons learned in what responsibility looks like from a funder perspective as a way of starting to answer this question. So the first lesson learned that I want to give you all, and this is a really important one, is to measure what you care about, which presupposes that you know what you care about, which all too often in bibliometrics and scientometrics, we don't actually know what we care about, and we don't spend the time to really think it is about what it is that we're trying to accomplish. So for some background and to explain what I mean by this, I want to take a quick sidestep into some theoretical aspects. So as many of you probably know, I started my career in librarianship, and so I was trained as a librarian. So in library school, one of the things that we learned was this theory of the concept of levels of information needs. This was developed by a researcher by the name of Robert Taylor in the 1960s, and it gets a little bit wonky, so I'm not going to really talk about all of the details, but the primary thing that I think is most relevant from that theory is the realization that when we're looking for information or when we're asking questions, we don't ask for what we need, we ask for what we think we can get, or we ask for what we know about, not necessarily what we need. This has profound implications for research evaluation because what we're often asking for in research evaluation settings is different from what we actually need. So a researcher who is asking for a bunch of H indexes for a bunch of applicants is not actually interested in the numbers. That's not the actual information need. What the information need is a shorthand way of evaluating those applicants to try and pick the best one. Now, obviously, that's a really problematic need, but that's the actual need that's there, not the numbers. So again, this is a really problematic concept because from evaluation, we're taught to assess programs and to assess people and so forth by what they're trying to accomplish. In evaluation speak, we call this, what are the outcomes that this program is trying to achieve? So what happens is we get caught between these two. We don't think deeply about what the accomplishments are that the program is trying to achieve. And so what we end up doing is we ask for what we know about or what we think we can get as a shorthand for what that program is trying to accomplish. And so what we end up doing is we mismatch the indicators to the needs. We ask for things, for indicators because we know about them, whether or not those indicators actually have anything to do with what we're trying to measure. So the way out of this, I think, is to borrow some additional theory from evaluation and to build a set of outcomes, to build a program evaluation framework to help frame where these measures fit into this larger landscape. So what you're looking at here is a very rough draft of an evaluation framework that I'm trying to develop for NICHD. So again, this is very much in the early stages and it's not finalized yet, but this is a direction that I'm headed. So to explain what this is, I want to start at the end with the long-term outcomes on the right and work our way backwards to the left. So it seems to me that we at the NIH and the NICHD are interested in two major long-term outcomes. We're trying to do research, right? We're trying to foster a research environment in which we can make discoveries and we can learn about the world and essentially learn about human health. We're also interested in trying to improve people's health. So our entire mission is to do research to improve people's health. So it seems to me those are the long-term outcomes that we're trying to achieve with everything that we do as a funding agency. So the question then becomes, how do we achieve that? What are some of the intermediate term outcomes that are necessary for having these long-term outcomes? How do you create new research? So the way that I have had this broken down is into two outcome streams. I've got the research outcome streams and health outcome streams. So for the research outcomes, how do you produce new research? Well, you have to have information. You have to have knowledge to draw on. So you have to have an informed research community in order to build upon the research that's already happened. You need infrastructure, you need supplies, you need equipment, you need reagents, facilities, buildings, those kinds of things to do research in. You need people to do the research, and you need an environment in which that research is valued and can be conducted. I'm channeling Gemma Derrick here from the UK, but I think it's really important to include a supportive environment in this set of research outcomes because it is really important to create a safe and inclusive work environment, an environment that actually values research in order to allow researchers to flourish in that environment. So similarly for health outcomes, how do we achieve health? Well, through new technologies, new treatments, new policies, better services, better health behavior, all of these other kinds of things. I'm probably forgetting some things, but this is the general idea. So these are the intermediate term outcomes. Moving backwards from that, well, how do we achieve these intermediate outcomes? Through a series of more shorter term outcomes, things like knowledge creation and dissemination, through the creation and improvement of research facilities, through the creation and training of researchers, health policy experts, and the supply of capital for businesses to develop technologies. So these short-term outcomes start to look very much like the things that we can actually measure, right? They start looking like the kinds of things that we can actually sort of pull the levers on to improve our operations. So the final step then is to say, okay, we're funding these various kinds of programs to try and produce these short-term outcomes. So we have programs like research networks, research projects, infrastructure projects, training projects, et cetera, in order to create these short-term outcomes that then lead to these long-term outcomes that we're ultimately trying to achieve. So I think the way this helps is to create, when we're talking about impact, we're talking about pathways through this framework. We're talking about going from a research project through each of these sets of outcomes to try and get to the longer term outcomes that we're trying to achieve. So let me give you some examples. So if we fund a research project and we fund, say, a clinical trial, what we're trying to do is we're trying to create and disseminate knowledge from that clinical trial that then has two streams of intermediate outcomes. We have outcomes on the research community because the knowledge that's created through that clinical trial is then communicated to the rest of the research community who can then build on that research and do future research. And we are also trying to produce health outcomes. So maybe the clinical trial is to pilot a new treatment. So the knowledge that's created from the trial then results in a new improved treatment, which goes on and improves health. So when we're trying to evaluate this kind of project, we need measures and we need pathways for both of these kinds of outcomes. So let me give you another example. For a research center, the pathways are similar, but they're a little bit more complicated because a research center is we're really funding a laboratory to do all kinds of research. And so the laboratory, yes, is interested in creating and disseminating knowledge, which then goes through the research outcome pathway to fuel new research. But the health outcomes are going to be slightly different. In this case, what we're looking at is more of a sociological research center. So for a sociological research center, a new improved treatment doesn't make any sense because that's not what they're trying to do. What they're trying to do is to create knowledge that results in policies that then improve health. So if we can create these different policy aspects, or we can have other kinds of socioeconomic impacts to then improve health, we then need to measure that in a different pathway. And then there's secondary outcome streams around facilities and training of new researchers, which then go on to spur new research. So again, when we're talking about evaluating this research center program, we need measures for all of these different pathways. Finally, for a training program, it looks very, very different, again, because a training program is really trying to produce people, right? I mean, put very crudely, we're trying to create the next generation of healthcare workers. So what we're trying to do with a training program is to produce researchers who then result in a diverse and skilled workforce who then go on and do research. But we're also creating other health policy positions. So we're training people to go into healthcare. We're training people to go into health policy. We're training people to do all kinds of other jobs within the healthcare environment to then go on to create better policies and better services which improve health. So this is what I mean by when talking about impact pathways, is we wanted to see to what degree are what we're doing having these pathways to get to the kinds of long-term outcomes that we really care about. So what we need to do is develop measures based on this impact evaluation framework. So what we need are measures of knowledge and creation and dissemination, which are then going to be different from measures of whether or not that knowledge gets used in the research community to then do new research. We need different measures for whether or not that knowledge results in new treatments, and then additional measures to say, do those treatments improve health? So this is the idea behind the direction that I'm headed, is using this kind of framework to say, okay, what are the measures that we need in order to tell this kind of story, this kind of impact story? The other thing that it does is it allows us to rethink the measures that we currently use. So one of the things that we use all the time in bibliometrics is just measuring publications, right? One of the things we're very interested in is how many publications got produced by a program. We tend to use that so frequently, we don't stop to think about what it is we're actually trying to measure with those publications. So but by using this kind of a framework, we're saying, okay, what we're really trying to measure is knowledge creation and knowledge dissemination. We're using publications as a proxy measure for those outcomes. But when you stop and think about it, if what we're really interested in is knowledge creation and knowledge dissemination, publications are only one way of doing that, right? There are so many other ways that researchers can create and disseminate knowledge. They can do it through blog posts. They can do it through preprints. They can do it through data sets, software. They can do it through clinical trial registry platforms. All kinds of these other types of outputs meet these same criteria. So it allows us to rethink the measures that we're using and to accept the limitations of those measures in assessing the overall impact of a particular program. So that's what I mean by measure what you care about. The second lesson learned that I want to talk about is never, ever take a measure at face value. Never accept the value of an indicator as truth, essentially. Another pet peeve of mine is that we often work with researchers who have spent their entire careers doing scientific research, and they've spent their entire careers thinking very, very carefully about data and being very skeptical about data and being skeptical about methods and the validity of methods. But as soon as you have mentioned evaluation, all of those skills kind of go out the window. We just stop using them. We stop applying these kinds of critical thinking skills to our evaluation measures. And I think our evaluation measures should be held to the same standard as other measures are. So again, I work in healthcare, we use diagnostics all the time. No clinician in their right mind would ever accept a new diagnostic test if it hadn't been studied in at least 3 or 4 well-designed trials, and that all say that this new diagnostic works better than what we already have. I think we need to apply the same standards to bibliometric indicators, and we don't. We don't do that nearly as much as we should. So it's really important then to think critically about the measures that we're using, and to think about what we might be missing by using these indicators. So let me give you a couple of examples. One example is related to our training programs. So as I mentioned, we fund a lot of research training programs to train the next generation of researchers in the US and abroad. So we have a number of different mechanisms through which we do this training. So we've got these different activity codes like T32, K12, T35, K23, et cetera. So that's what the columns in these charts mean. So these different mechanisms have obviously very different numbers of trainees. We've trained almost 10,000 people through the T32 mechanism, where we've only trained about 1,000 people through the K12 program. One of the things that is very popular at the NIH is to try and determine the success of a training program through the % of trainees who have received another NIH grant. The idea here is that if we're trying to train the next generation of researchers, these researchers should then go on and get a new NIH grant to go off and do their independent research. So we say, okay, what % of the trainees have received another NIH grant? Now, In my opinion, that's a really, really narrow way of defining success. And there are all kinds of problems with defining it that way, because there are all sorts of legitimate career pathways that we're not capturing in this measure of success. But with that said, even if we do accept this as a measure, what we can then do is look at this percent of trainees receiving a grant across these different mechanisms to say how successful these mechanisms are. And so what we can see very clearly is the T32 program is not theoretically as successful as, say, the K-12 mechanism. So roughly about a quarter of the T32 trainees actually have received a new NIH grant, as compared to nearly half of the K-12 mechanisms. So if you didn't think more clearly and critically about this measure, one might be tempted to conclude that the K-12 mechanism is more successful at training researchers. But if you do think more critically about it, you would make a distinction between trainees and applicants. So you can't get an NIH grant if you don't apply for an NIH grant. So what's important is to look at how many of these trainees actually applied for NIH funding. And what we can see very clearly is nearly 60% of our T32 trainees don't apply for funding. So if 60% of the trainees don't apply, of course, a very low proportion of the overall trainees are going to have an NIH grant, because the majority of them didn't apply for one. Similarly, for the K-12 mechanism, the vast majority, in fact, over 70% of the K-12 trainees have applied for funding. So what's going on? It turns out that the T32 mechanism is for anyone at a postdoctoral research institution. So anybody who's trying to get a master's degree or a PhD program can apply and participate in a T32 program. Whereas the K-12 mechanism is specifically designed for undergraduates or for graduate students who have decided to become researchers. So the entire point of the K-12 mechanism is to train people who have already decided they wanted to go into research, whereas the T32 program includes a lot of people who haven't made that decision. So if you redefine the metric to say what proportion of the people who have actually applied for funding who have gotten a grant, all of a sudden the picture looks very, very different. All of a sudden those large differences largely disappear. So it's important to think very critically about what the measures are and what the context is for which you actually intend to use those measures. Another example is what you might term the productivity of various award mechanisms. So one of the things that a lot of people at NIH tend to like to do is to say, what is our return on investment for the investments that we make in biomedical research? Now, again, I think this is a really problematic question, and I think it's the wrong question to be asking, but it is a question that can be asked. So what you could do is theoretically say, okay, how many total publications has NIH gotten out of, say, the R01 mechanism, as opposed to, say, the T32 mechanism, to say, okay, these are the number of publications that we've gotten. So we've gotten maybe 1.2 million R01 publications and a smaller number of other publications from other mechanisms. You can theoretically then also add up the total amount of US dollars that we've spent on these R01 mechanisms. And if you divide the total cost of the mechanism by the total number of publications, one can theoretically come up with a cost per publication, right? It's something you can do. And it turns out it's somewhere around $25,000 per publication. But again, there are very substantial differences among this measure in these different activity codes. So the T32 program, as you can see, has a very low cost per publication. The P30 has a very low cost per publication. P01 is very low. The R21 is, by contrast, an extremely high cost per publication. So one could theoretically conclude that maybe we ought to spend more on these P30 mechanisms because we get a lot of publications out of them and they are comparatively low cost per publication. But what's actually going on here? What's actually going on is funding doesn't happen in a vacuum, and activity codes don't produce publications on their own. They're combined. There are co-funding rates among these different activity codes. So it turns out that nearly 70 to 75% of the publications that cite a T32 grant also cite some other grant in addition to the T32. The most common, the R01 mechanism. Similarly for the P30 and P01 mechanisms, the vast majority of the publications that cite these P30 mechanisms are co-funded with R01 grants. So we're actually combining costs of these different activity codes and these different projects to actually produce publications. So again, what's going on is the T32 is actually doing exactly what we want the T32 program to do. The T32 is designed, remember, to train researchers. So what happens is they partner with established researchers to do research in a laboratory and produce publications. So the T32 mechanism depends on the R01 funding of the mentor for the production of the T32 publication. It's a combined effort. So just looking at the activity codes in isolation ignores what's actually happening in the field and ignores what we want to happen in the field. And by the way, I'm just talking about NIH co-funding here. I'm not even talking about co-funding from other funding agencies or from other funding streams. So it's even more complicated than just this activity code co-funding rate. So again, we need to think very carefully about these measures. We need to think about the applications of these measures and what these measures are actually telling us. I also, before I move on to the next lesson learned, I also want to give a quick reminder that just because a measure has been published in the peer-reviewed literature doesn't mean the indicator is valid. This is something that we often get confused about, and we often try and sort of put the cart before the horse, so to speak, and we try and rush to implement measures before we know anything about them. As I mentioned before, we don't do a lot of validation studies in bibliometric indicators. We just don't. So the vast majority of the indicators that are out there have never been independently validated by somebody else. And that's a real problem. And so what we need to do is to spend more time thinking very critically about these measures. After all, the H-index has been published, right? And it's never been retracted. The H-index was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States, and it's out there in the world. That doesn't mean that the H-index is a valid measure. It doesn't. So we need to remember that just because somebody has found something that seems to work in one study doesn't mean that that indicator actually works in practice. So just a reminder, use your critical thinking skills when it comes to all of these indicators. The third lesson learned that I want to offer is another important one, and that is measures can't make decisions. Indicators cannot make decisions for you because, in part, going back to lesson learned number one, measures can't tell you what you care about, and it can't tell you what to do in any given situation. And so it's up to us to interpret those measures in a responsible way and to take them with a grain of salt and incorporate them into the decision-making process in some way. You can't use a measure to make a decision. You just can't. So it's important to then think about the broader landscape in which this decision takes place. So let me give you some examples again. So at NICHD, a couple of years ago, we released and developed a new strategic plan for what we want to do as a funding agency moving forward. And in that strategic plan, we identified 5 major scientific theme areas that we say are really important to us, and really important for us to support and fund and drive research forward in. So these 5 themes are listed here. I'm not going to read them, but essentially they correspond to some of the major populations that we're interested in. So theme 3 is all about pregnancy. Theme 2 is all about gynecologic, andrologic, and reproductive health. Theme 4 is all about pediatrics, and theme 5 is all about advancing drugs, therapeutics, and devices. Okay, so now that we know what areas of science we're interested in, the question naturally comes up, well, what are we doing in these areas? What are we funding related to these themes? How is that changing over time? These natural questions. So they brought me in to try and answer them. So I developed a method to map about 30,000 of our research projects to these 5 themes. I'm not going to get into the weeds of the actual method, but essentially I use text mining techniques to assign documents to these themes based on term frequencies in those documents. It's the essential idea. So once I had them all mapped to these themes, I can say, okay, what proportion of our funding goes to theme 1 versus theme 4, or how is that changing over time? So I came up with a plot that looks a little bit like this, where I'm plotting the total research funding in US dollars to each of these themes per year and looking at the trends over time. So we can see that largely the funding is relatively stable over time. We can see that theme 4 is the highest over the entire time period, followed by themes 3 and 5. And then the least amount of funding is related to themes 1 and 2. It's changed a little bit over time. Obviously, there's a massive decrease in funding on theme 4. That's largely due to a research contract that was done during this time period that eventually went away. That's what that was. But then we can also see an increase in funding for theme 5 over the past couple of years, which is an interesting dynamic because that's all about, again, pharmacology, devices, therapeutics. So that's for all awards. And so we can say, okay, that's what this looks like for all award types. But we could break it down further and look at what this looks like for different kinds of awards, right? So we've got our research projects, we've got our training programs, we've got small business programs. What does it look like in each of these kinds of programs? Turns out it looks really different in these different types of mechanisms. So our research projects in the upper right is really, really focused on theme 4, whereas our centers and networks funding is more focused on theme 3, although it's come more in line more recently with some of the other themes. Our SBIR, STTR programs in the lower left, which are our small business programs, are perhaps not surprisingly all about therapeutics and devices. Kind of makes sense. Our training programs also look a little bit different. So where our institutional training programs are really focused on themes 2 and 4 without a lot of funding in theme 3, whereas our centers and networks are very focused on theme 3, and our research projects are also fairly focused on theme 3. So all of this begs the question, what should this look like? What should our allocation actually be? Should we be devoting a lot of our research project funding to theme 4? Or should we be spending more on theme 2? Should our training programs look like our research programs? After all, if we're trying to train the next generation of investigators, are we training people to do the research that we're already supporting? Should it look like that, or should it look different? Should we be training something in a different way in order to encourage the research to move in a different direction? I don't know the answers to any of those questions. But the point is to raise these questions. The point is to say, okay, now that we know what the distribution does look like, we can start asking more meaningful questions about what should it look like. So again, none of these measures and none of these analyses are going to make decisions before you because it can't tell you what you value. It can't tell you what it is that you're trying to accomplish. It can't tell you what this distribution should look like. It only tells you what it does look like. So when we're using indicators and we're using measures, it's important to understand that we need to ask larger questions of these measures. And so I think what this does is this leads us to a more interesting approach, and it leads us to the final take-home message that I want to leave you with, which is that I think the role of data and the role of analyses is not necessarily to answer questions, but rather to help you ask the right questions. The goal and the purpose of analyses and data is to focus the questions. It's to raise questions. It's to point you in certain directions that can't necessarily be answered through analytics, but can be answered through other types of qualitative information, right? We can take all of these thematic analyses back to our leadership and say, okay, what do we want to do? What kinds of emphases do we want to have? It can raise those more interesting questions to then lead us in new directions. And so I think this is the direction that I want to move in, is to use analytics to help us move in these right directions. So the final example that I want to leave you with, and that I think illustrates most of these lessons learned, is this analysis of funding to female PIs over the same time period. So one of the things that NICHD is very, very committed to is to increasing the diversity of our funders, the funding population. So increasing the diversity of the people that we fund. We've known for a long time that our funding tends to be concentrated in the hands of older white men. We know that, and we've known that for a long time. And so we are very committed to changing that population pool to something that looks a bit more like what our actual population looks like and what our populations look like. So one of the ways that we can do this is to say, okay, what do our populations actually look like now? What does the funding allocation actually look like among men versus women? So this is one example that I can give you. So what I did is I took, again, all of those 30,000 research projects, and I estimated the gender of each of the principal investigators using their first name, using a gender estimation algorithm. Now, I know this is imperfect, which is why the lines are a bit fuzzy around the edges, but I happen to know from some validation studies that this estimation method is within 1 to 2 percentage points of the self-reported totals. So I feel pretty confident about the results here. So there's a lot to this graph. And so what I've done is I've just plotted the proportion of funding to female PIs for different mechanisms over a 10-year time period. So the first thing that we might want to do is look at the proportion of research project funding, the dark brown line that has gone to women over this time period. So this is where we spend the majority of our dollars. So this might be the first thing that we want to look at. And so what we can see is we start out at around 40% and we move to something close to 47, 48% by 2019. So on the face of it, that's really good news, right? We're getting actually pretty close to gender parity in our research project funding. And in fact, we're actually, as NICHD, we're actually about 10 percentage points higher than the overall NIH average, which tends to hover somewhere around 37, 38%. So on the face of it, good news. But if you look deeper, and if you look more carefully at some of these other trends, there's a lot more that we need to do to ensure that we're actually funding a diverse set of populations. So the first thing to look at, obviously, would be the light brown line at the bottom, which is our SBIR small business programs. The funding rates to women are extremely low there. To some degree, that may be structural because we know that women are underrepresented as business owners, but that still doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and increase that. We should try and increase that. And so there are mechanisms that we might be able to use to increase small business funding for women. We can also look at the research centers line, the medium blue that's also below 40%. Once again, we know that women are underrepresented in academic leadership positions, and so to some degree that low proportion is a reflection of those structural factors. But again, we shouldn't let that get in the way of encouraging progress in this area. We've still got a long way to go in that arena. The thing that I think is most worrying about this graph is the line for individual training grants in pink near the top. So our individual training programs have been going at least 60% to female principal investigators since at least 2010. And by 2019, that funding rate has been above 70%. So 70% of the trainees that we fund are women. And yet, only about 48% of our research project funding is going to women. So what's going on? What's happening? In some way, we're training people in our training women in our training programs, but that training isn't resulting in substantial increases in the research project funding that's going to women. I think part of the answer lies in the light blue line, which is the other research related line. And so that other research related funding is relative to career advancement types of research. So their fellowship programs, their mentorship programs, their career advancement programs. So one thing that might be happening is that women go through our individual training programs and then are increasingly turning to these alternative forms of funding to stay afloat because they're not getting the research project grants. I don't know if that's actually the case, but it certainly seems like a plausible hypothesis to then go out and test. So this is what I mean by using analytics to help us answer to ask the right questions. We need to ask questions about what's going on between the individual training grants and the project grants, what's going on with the substantial increase in other research related funding going to women. What's going on in all of this? Why hasn't the research project funding increased more quickly than it has? The analytics can't necessarily tell you the answers to that, but it can tell you that these are things that we need to be asking moving forward. And so that, I think, is the role of analytics, is to help us ask these questions. So with that, I will go ahead and end. Hopefully, again, I've given you at least an introduction to the direction that I think I'm headed in what responsibility looks like for a funding agency. Again, this is still very much a work in progress, and we're all kind of making it up as we go along. So definitely stay tuned, and I'll be happy to take any additional questions that may come up. Thanks.
Yay, Chris, that was fantastic. That was a super deep dive into the intricacies of funding at a very large level. You say that at the beginning you were saying that the NIH is actually small. You only do 10,000 publications a year, which is small, I guess, in terms of a large U.S. government agency. But that's huge. That would be a sizable university output.
Small is very definitely relative. We're not like, NIGMS or NNCI, which does maybe 15, 20,000 publications a year, but, we're still pretty big.
And the sheer amount of money you're talking about is quite impressive. So there's a lot of weight on your shoulders there. I have a number of questions that have come in quite recently. I'll try and combine a couple of them that are similar.
Sure.
You mentioned at the beginning how different indicators can be used to measure certain outcomes. What if the people asking the questions don't have faith in those indicators? And have you had success in advocating for this more reflective, deeper analysis, or are you getting pushback from administrators who are hoping for a quick turnaround on answers? And that's something, as bibliometricians, we always deal with. But the senior
Yeah.
admin wants numbers yesterday, but you're talking about pathways, which are more descriptive. Sure, there's a number at the end of the pathway, but do you get pushback
Yeah.
or?
I actually don't. It's interesting. Whenever I talk about this to folks at NIH, I think there's a real understanding that analytics can in fact play a role here. But I'm careful in the way that I introduce these concepts and I start with the caveats, honestly. I start with the limitations, and I want to make it clear to people that I have some degree of skepticism in these indicators too. I have questions about these indicators. They're not going to tell us all of the answers. But what they can do is, to channel one of my evaluator friends, is they can give us a less imperfect understanding of reality. And that's, I think, what we're trying to do here. We're trying to get a better understanding of what's actually going on. And the indicators can help us understand that. That's the direction that I tend to pitch it. And then again, when I use it, I use the language very carefully to inform decisions. I think that's a really important phrase for us, because we're not talking about making decisions with indicators. We're talking about informing decisions. If anything, what I need to do is I actually sometimes need to rein people back in, and it's to say not to put too much faith in the indicators. It's actually the opposite problem here. People tend to say, oh, great, we can measure things. Let's go ahead and measure things. Because remember, these are biomedical people. They're used to statistics. They're used to measuring things. And so in ways, I actually have to pull them back to say, no, don't put too much faith in this indicator. We need to think about it more critically.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's a good, very good point. Here's a short question for you. What sources did you use for the publications/metrics?
Yeah, tons and tons of sources. We rely on Reporter a lot. So it's an internal system that we've developed to match publications to grants. So I rely on that a lot. I rely on PubMed, which is our internal biomedical database. I rely on Scopus, I rely on publications, our insights, Web of Science. I rely on literally everything that I have access to. And what I actually use will depend on the question that I'm asking.
Yes, I forgot PubMed, of course. That's for you, that's in-house. You just walk down the corridor and there it is. It's behind door number 3. So here's a more, not so much a question, but a sort of a addressing a larger issue about the accuracy of the categorization and your need to do data mining techniques in order to put this paper or this grant into this bucket or that bucket. And the question is about that. It seems rather clumsy that we have to resort to these data mining techniques in order to do any sort of bibliometric analysis. And the question is, what do you think causes this problem, and how can we solve or improve subject metadata? That's a huge philosophical question. It goes back to the origin of journals. You got a bunch of journals on the shelf. How do you categorize them?
Yeah, so I think part of the problem is that we mean different things by different categorization schemes. We mean different things when we say epidemiology versus infectious diseases. What does that mean? I don't know what the infectious diseases actually means. I mean, that's a philosophical question. And so when you ask different people, you have different approaches. The other problem is that it's extremely difficult and extremely time consuming to do manual coding. And in fact, manual coding of articles to subjects is also an imperfect process, because I complain about this about mesh terms all the time, is that there's inconsistency in how mesh terms are applied because they're applied by human indexers. So I think to some degree, we're always going to have these problems because we mean different things and because none of the methods that we use are going to be 100% accurate, because there is no such thing as 100% accuracy. There is no such thing as an a priori data set of infectious disease publications. There just isn't, because it depends on your definition. So I think we have to rely on some of these things because we don't have a universal understanding of what it is that we're actually trying to do. Does that make sense?
Super. That sounds great. I didn't know that about mesh terms, because I take them as gospel.
Well, I
didn't
mean,
know
you
there was
should
anything
theoretically, but
anyways, that's enough questions for you, Chris. Thanks so much for joining us this morning and giving a very insightful look into how the rubber meets the road. I mean, it's one thing to think about bibliometrics in terms of ivory tower numbers and H indexes and all that, but you've actually got to deal with how the money gets spent. It's important.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting exercise. So again, thank you all very much. Really was really an honor to come talk to you all today.
Right. Super. Well, I'll see you somewhere at BRIC 2022.
Absolutely. I'm going to try and get there.
Okay.